Well, as I mentioned, it's been a decade since Chinese President Xi Jinping launched his country's Belt and Road Initiative. This massive infrastructure project initially planned to link China to Europe. It has since grown to include 147 countries, two-thirds of the world's population, and as much as 40% of international GDP. But what began as an ambitious infrastructure project has seen many areas get bogged down with incomplete bridges, roads to nowhere, and mountains of debt, while China is taking over control of more countries. Joining me now to discuss this is Gordon Chang, a distinguished senior fellow at the Gatestone Institute. He's the author of The Coming Collapse of China and the Great U.S.-China Tech War. You can follow him on X under the handle at Gordon G. Chang. Gordon, welcome back to Washington Watch. Always great to see you.
Thank you so much, Tony.
So this we're coming into the end of the first decade of this ambitious infrastructure project to kind of replace the ancient Silk Road economic development for China. But now we're getting reports that a lot of these projects have been halted, in fact, crumbling because of corruption, bankruptcy, and it looks like China's taking advantage of some of these countries.
Yeah, there are a number of factors at work here, and one of them is that China works through corruption. And so they have bribed elites in countries to engage in the Belt and Road program, and that has ended up, as you say, with projects to nowhere, the things that are crumbling and all the rest of it. The big underlying point here is that China was building infrastructure that the private sector just generally shunned as uneconomic. So there was always going to be, I think, almost inevitably, these projects would fail because they just didn't make sense. And what China's goal was to extend its geopolitical influence. Countries, on the other hand, had a very different goal, which was to get infrastructure. And so there has been this problem. And right now in Beijing, there's a lot of hand-wringing because people there think that the Belt and Road plan doesn't really benefit China as the way that they had originally contemplated.
But in some cases, as I've seen, I think you and I have talked about this before, Gordon, that some of these countries that have defaulted on paying back their loans, really, China's acting like almost like loan sharks in some of these cases, and they're taking property, rare minerals, and other things from these countries.
Yes, and the geopolitical aspect here should concern us. Even though the Belt and Road program in many ways is a failure, nonetheless, it threatens the United States. So, for instance, there's a Belt and Road project in Freeport in the Bahamas. That's within 90 miles of Palm Beach. And that project, by the way, is not working out very well. And that means we could see China take it over, which means that it could become a Chinese naval base within 100 miles of Florida. So these are the things that we always have to be concerned about because China's geopolitical goals, as we know, are malicious.
I mean, this is not contained with just in a couple places. I mean, they're moving across the country, as I mentioned, across the world, 147 different countries, in particular in Africa, where they're moving in. And these are poor countries. It doesn't take a whole lot to buy influence there. And at the same time, we have a foreign policy by this administration that's pushing, in many cases, ideologies that are in complete contrast to these countries in Africa. For instance, the abortion issue, the LGBTQ. Are we not pushing them even further into the arms of China?
We certainly are, because especially in conservative Africa, you have, not only Christianity, but also generally you have this notion of traditional values. And the United States is pushing these countries to do things which they certainly find abhorrent. Now, the Chinese don't do that. The Russians don't do that, which means that these countries have a hard choice. And many of them have chosen China because, as we started to talk in the beginning of this segment, China has corrupted the elites to engage, to start these Belt and Road projects, which means the United States is even further behind in Africa than we need to be. And that is directly traceable to Biden's social policies that Africans abhor.
I wish this is one of those occasions where I wish I had a whiteboard because I'd want to write here and connect these dots. because China is funding these initiatives, buying influence, and in some cases buying countries, and they're doing it with the profits that they make off the U.S. I mean, we're the ones that are really fueling their ability to do this, are we not?
Oh, we certainly are. And also, there's another aspect to this, and that is the IMF is coming in to bail out some of these countries that owe money to China. Well, that's really a bailout of China. So, for instance, in Pakistan, where you have negotiations right now on the Belt and Road, China has the $60 billion China-Pakistan economic corridor. Some of the projects make sense. Many of them don't. Pakistan can't pay back. And it's going to be the United States bailing out China. And that is just absolutely wrong.
Yeah, I mean, we're the major funder for the International Monetary Fund. And so what we have here is it's kind of like the scandals here in the United States with the payday loans, where someone goes and I mean, essentially we are impoverishing many of these countries and driving them further into debt, into the arms of China by doing this.
Yes, and the Chinese absolutely refuse to take what's called a haircut. They will not reduce their principal. And that means these countries have to surrender, as you pointed out, valuable parts of their country. So it's a loss of sovereignty. And we are seeing China take infrastructure. So, for instance, in Sri Lanka, the port of Hambantota has now become effectively a Chinese naval base in the Indian Ocean. And we see this elsewhere. And it could very well be, as I mentioned, in our own hemisphere, very close to the American homeland.
Gordon Chang, if it were not for the United States backing them up financially, not directly, but indirectly through the International Monetary Fund and through our trade deficit with them, they wouldn't be able to do this.
They certainly wouldn't be able to. It is U.S. Trade, investment, technical cooperation that has fueled China's rise. We are directly responsible for it. And this is morally wrong. China is preparing to kill Americans. That's what it's doing with its military. And also it's committing genocide and crimes against humanity in not only Xinjiang, which is the northwest part where the Uyghurs and the Kazakhs are, but also in Tibet. So it is just morally wrong for us to do this.
How fragile is the Chinese economy so that if we did get our foreign policy straight, would they come tumbling down?
They probably would, because right now we are giving them a lifeline. You know, American business should not be in China for a number of reasons. But the Biden administration is dog whistling for them to stay. Excuse me, for them to stay. And that means we are providing that critical source of funds. And essentially what we are doing is giving them the confidence to continue their malicious policies against the U.S. They make it very clear that they view us as an existential threat and that they have to destroy America because they are worried about the inspirational impact of our values and our form of governance on the Chinese people. So there is no amicable relations we can have with China over the long term. And we have to understand that because they are out to kill Americans.
It just doesn't make sense. Gordon Chang, thanks so much for joining us. Always appreciate your insights.
Thank you so much, Tony.